So I hope that it's clear here what he's saying in these first few pages, that there is simply no logical support for either subjective relativism or conventional relativism. The diversity thesis and the dependency thesis just punt the ball down the road. And cultural relativism devolves into individual relativism. And when in Rome, do as the Romans do is a recipe for not only disaster when it comes to a culture's relationship to another culture, but a recipe for disaster for intra-cultural relationships as well. It falls into Plato's trap by saying that it's illogical to have a moral principle that says absolutely there are no moral principles. So everybody keep that in mind as you go through this dependency thesis, diversity thesis, cultural relativism, individual or subjective relativism. Again, read the Ted Bundy section as an example of what happens when one accepts the subjective ethical relativism idea that one is a kingdom to oneself. You have nihilism. Look that up in the dictionary, by the way, not only on that first part of the chapter where he talks about ethical nihilism, but look up that definition of nihilism. It's a wonderful word to know. Sometimes it sort of describes the situation that we find ourselves in, sometimes in politics. So, conventional ethical relativism leads to tribalism, which leads to the war of all against all. Now, let's turn on, we're a few pages here, a few sections before the end of this chapter. Look down to the discussion of moral diversity is exaggerated. I did one of my master's theses on a German philosopher by the name of Robert Hartman, who came to this country to escape Nazism. Dr. Hartman was one of the few people that I know of that tried to mathematize philosophy. And he started by putting together math and logic, and was one of the first people to argue that math and logic are really subspecies of each other. But anyway, he became interested in using a type of mathematics called set theory that allowed one to talk about huge groups of things, infinitesimal groups of like kinds. And when Dr. Hartman began to apply this mathematics to the possibility of actions for human beings, he discovered that there's far more unanimity, even in societies that look like they differ from one another, than people at first thought when they began to look at these simply as aggregate observations. The accusation from Dr. Hartman is that sociology and the type of ethicists that um, that Dr. Pojman exhibit here had failed to understand the logical connections that the human mind simply brought to bear on the subject of what ought I to do. He's dead now, of course. He came up with the Hartman Value Inventory. And as a graduate student, I used to give this Hartman Value Inventory to broad ranges of people. We had people that went to other countries, other areas of the world, and gave this quiz, mathematically graded, to vast numbers of people. And we found that there is almost unanimity of agreement across all cultures, at least linguistic cultures, cultures that use language, than anybody ever thought. Now, those names change. They're called different things, but the concepts remain the same across cultures. For instance, one of my colleagues was Russian and went back, or at least spoke Russian and went back to Russia. This was during the communist regime in Russia, and gave this list, and people would prioritize the good things and the bad things in the list. One of the good things, other than love and those sort of fuzzy concepts, was power failure. Now, you might say, you had a recent example of a power failure, which I can say, yes, I did. And I didn't like it one little bit. It really, of all things in this life, a power failure probably bugs me way up there. I simply have signed on to the technological life, and without electricity of some form or another, it's impossible. But when the Russians saw power failure, they rated that way up there with where we rate vacation. Going to the beach, taking a week off. Why in the world would someone look at something like a power failure, which in the West then and especially now is verboten? I mean, it's awful. Your meat freezes, you can't get on your computer, the internet doesn't work. Everything thaws and you lose money. It's awful. Well, in communist Russia, people worked 24/7. You didn't get a day off. There was no sanctity of Sunday in communist Russia. So you worked from morning to dark, 7 days a week. The only time you got off was when the power went down. So they're not voting necessarily for what we call power failures. They're voting yay for things that we understood as vacation, time off, time by yourself with your family, whatever. So it looked like there was a huge discrepancy in what people valued, but it came to be the same thing. In Russia and America, they valued time by themselves, quality time with their family, and power failure for a Russian meant that. So this is just one example of the fact that these differences, most often, according to Dr. Hartman, are semantic differences. When you apply mathematics to it, when you apply strict analysis to it, when you attach moral theory and practice to it, it turns out to be exaggerated, this diversity. So anyway, that's an example of what we mean, or what I think a better example of what Pojman looks as the exaggeration of moral diversity. The importance of moral diversity is exaggerated. That's one example of that. All right. Looking on down, we find weak dependency does not imply relativism. Look at his definitions there of weak dependency and strong dependency. Weak dependency, the application of moral principles depends on one's culture. Strong dependency, the moral principles themselves depend on one's culture. Weak thesis, how you interpret ethics depends on your culture. Strong dependency, strong thesis, the culture itself controls, establishes the exact truth of moral principles. So one is opinion about, the other one is exact proof. Now, let's go on, think about that, read through that section, and let's go to his discussion of the indeterminacy of language. And he cites one of my old teachers here, Willard Van Orman Quine. He says relativists still have at least one more arrow in their quiver. The argument from the indeterminacy of translation, the theory set forth by Willard V. It's called Van Orman, his middle name, Quine, holds that languages are often so fundamentally different from each other that we cannot accurately translate concepts from one to the other. Now, this kind of misses Dr. Quine's point here. Quine was famous for saying that language itself is indeterminate. So what one must do because of the indeterminacy of language is learn mathematics and logic. Because language is imprecise, according to Quine, we all need to apply ourselves to both logic and mathematics, which is extremely precise. So truth is established logically and mathematically because language itself is so up for grabs. That's partly true, I think, but Dr. Quine's got an axe to grab here and to apply, because he wants to make sure that we testify about truth mathematically, linguistically, not linguistically, but mathematically and logically, so that that can be tested vis-a-vis everybody else's use of symbols that have a common understanding, cross-cultural understanding. His argument is that words are fuzzy. The plus sign isn't fuzzy. Plus sign is absolute. Equal sign is absolute. Times, divide, all of these things, you know exactly what to do. When you see a number two, a plus, and another number two, you put equal and 4. That is not indeterminate for Dr. Quine. That's absolute. So if we seek absolute knowledge, we must seek it mathematically. That's his point. Now, I think from my experience with Dr. Quine, he misses some of the salient qualities of language itself. We can make language precise. As a matter of fact, that's what we do. We use letters. We use Greek letters. We use American English letters when we do mathematical operations. I don't see that as prohibiting or making language imprecise. I see that as a way of making language precise. We worry a lot about that. For instance, the sacred text of the Jews has been translated into thousands of languages. Some of them are completely oblivious to the idea of language as language is defined in English, German, or other Western languages. For instance, there is if you remember, there's a delightful a tribe of people in Africa called the Kosians, K-O-S-I-A-N, the Kosian people. One of the most fascinating people, certainly on the face of the earth. They have a language that's made up of very strange clicking sounds. I invite you to look up a video. Go in and look up a YouTube video of people speaking in the Kosian language. It says simply clicks. Sounds to us as if it is a click. Well, the Bible's been translated into Kosian. Now you would think that something as strange as that language would be impossible to translate a Western language, Hebrew and Greek, into. You would think that would be a virtual impossibility. It's a standard that's completely different than each other, yet there are people that have been able to convey religious truths in that very foreign, appealing and sounding language. Now that doesn't sound much like language is totally indeterminate, does it? Well, it's not. I disagree with Dr. Pojman on that, and I don't disagree with Professor Quine because I value very much what he taught, and I don't think this is the correct interpretation of what he taught. But anyway, then of course look at the conclusion, and that finishes our discussion, our tumble through chapter 2. So anybody got any questions, problems, concerns that they want to ask me about before we stop doing what we're doing? Might be helpful. If you have a question, other people might have the same question. All right, everybody understand what's coming up for next week and the exam after that?
Yes.
And the fact that you'll have 10 days to do that exam? I hope that's fair. Try to be fair. All right, if I don't hear a question real quick, then we're gonna stop for this week. This will be up on, that's not Kosian, by the way, that was simply my clicking to fill time. It'll be up on YouTube this afternoon, not too far hence. Okay, then I'll bid you a good weekend. Everybody stay dry and stay healthy. And I'll talk to you with a lecture toward the first of next week. Thank you.